Welcome to the Winner's Playbook with Steve and Josh. Disclaimer: the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into account your personal circumstances. Please head to the show notes if you wish to book a free 15-minute call to discuss your personal situation.
So, welcome back to the Winner's Playbook. I'm Josh Lee, and I'm joined with another fantastic guest, not my usual partner in crime, Stephen Sloan. I've actually joined here with Nicole Sandler, who is also a financial advisor. However, Nicole is a cross-border specialist who has been helping clients who have moved to Spain with their investment, retirement planning, tax, estate planning needs, and also much more. Nicole, welcome to the Winner's Playbook. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, Josh. Thank you so much for having me. I've been really excited to come onto this podcast, so thank you.
No problems at all. And obviously, we're obviously not sitting here in the same country. So do you want to maybe just let the listeners know exactly where you are at this point in time? Because you are over in Europe, very different in terms of the climate to where we are in Australia.
I am. I'm enjoying the European summer at the moment. So I live in Spain. It's quite a small town called Javier, which is on the Costa Blanca. So it's in between Valencia and Alicante, just directly across from Ibiza. It's quite a small town. It's definitely not a city. There's probably less than 30,000 people that live here. I think I'm the only Australian, but it's a really, really stunning coastline. So if anyone is in Spain, I can highly recommend it if you've got extra time. I've been here for 10 years now.
Well, that's what I want to touch on first. So before we get into the nitty gritty of kind of a bit of what you do and how the financial advice space actually looks over in Spain specifically, could you talk to us a bit about like your journey? So like what originally motivated you to get up out of Australia, of which you're from, and then set off on the journey that you have? And can you sort of talk to us about that journey and what's kind of brought you to where you are now then?
Yeah, sure. So I've been away for a while now. I'm originally from the Gold Coast in Australia, and after my first degree at university, I've got a British passport. So I thought, well, I'll put it to good use and I'll go do the travel thing in Europe for a couple of years and then come back to Australia. But as I say, that was 18 years ago, and I started out in the UK. I lived there for 8 years, in quite small towns as well throughout the southwest of England, and I worked for quite a large wealth management company there, which was really fun. But I think it was one dark day in February, I just waved the white flag with the weather and thought, I cannot do this anymore. I need to get out. I wasn't quite ready to come back to Australia, so I knew I wanted to live somewhere in Europe. My first preference was Spain, but I was considering France or Portugal or Italy as well. And I started to look around online and got a really good job with another wealth management company in Spain, and that's how I ended up here. So my professional background is really a cross-border specialist between the UK and Spain. But in saying that, now I speak to a lot of Australians who are based in Spain. Most of them are in Barcelona, so it's quite nice to speak to other Australians again, because it's just been such a long time that I haven't done.
Yeah, and so is that then predominantly like what your client base now looks like? Is it predominantly Australians that have then moved over and are now living permanently in Spain?
Yeah, it's really mixed actually. So my background was always just British retired nationals that have moved from the UK into Spain. And I changed companies a couple of years ago to the company I'm at now, Chase Buchanan. And now the demographic of my clients has changed a lot with their ages as well. It's not just retirees. I speak to a lot of sort of high earning professionals, lots of Australians, some Kiwis, Canadians, basically English speaking foreign nationals who aren't American is my demographic. So it's widened a lot in recent years, which is nice.
Yeah, and are you then seeing like a bit of a trend? Like what's actually, other than, in Melbourne right now, it's freezing and getting over to Europe sounds amazing. Like what are some of the trends, or like what's the motivation behind some of those people? Like, are they generally people that have hit retirement that are getting out of Australia? Like the kids, they're off, they've gone to school now, or you're seeing younger couples? Like I myself have some clients that have gone over and have, hit like the UAE, and they're going to be living there for a period of time and ultimately do want to come back to Australia. But is it a particular demographic or age, or is it a complete mixed bag?
It's mixed, to be honest. I think especially since the pandemic, it just kind of rewired the way that we think about a lot of things, especially when it comes to work and travel. And we just realize the world's even a smaller place, and you can really be a true remote worker now, more so than before. So I actually speak to quite a lot of people in the UAE, Australians and also British people that aren't quite ready to go back to Australia. So they want a stepping stone in between. So a lot of them do consider Europe as well. But so it's mixed, I would say. It's younger people with young families, for example, but it's also retirees. So, and I speak to Australians all around the world, not just from Australia, but living abroad in general, and they're just not ready to go back yet, but want to go somewhere in Europe. So I think it's more of a well-trodden path now than it used to be. And I think, as I say, especially since the pandemic, I've noticed an upward trend with people moving here.
Yeah. And is it then anything in particular like that is actually sort of like pulling people to Spain? Like, is there anything that you'd actually put down to why they're moving there? Like I said, I've got clients that are in the UAE and they're obviously going there for tax purposes because it's in a low tax environment. They're earning tax-free dollars and it's amazing. Like, is there any key things happening in Spain that we're not aware of over here as to what's like driving and motivating people to actually move over and set up, besides the weather, of course?
Sure. I think people come to Spain for all different reasons, but the common denominator is always lifestyle. Spain is a lifestyle choice more than anything. So if somebody's really tax sensitive, for example, they'll typically look at other countries, maybe Malta, Cyprus, Italy, Portugal. Spain, it's not the best, it's not the worst when it comes to tax. It's like a 5 out of 10, I would say,
Sure. Okay.
on the tax point of view. But the cost of living is cheaper, which needs to be taken into consideration as well. But it's definitely a lifestyle thing. It's usually people that are sick of the rat race. They don't want this, they're not seeing their family. All they're doing is working or commuting, and they just want to push pause on life, and they've reevaluated things. Or quite often I speak to people that have moved here, they've had a health scare as well, situations like that, and they think, I need to change things dramatically. And in southern Mediterranean Europe, you've got no choice but to sort of slow down. It really is this slow living concept where life and family and community is so much more important than working. They've just got the values right, I think, if that's what you're into. So it's quite interesting. I think it's definitely a lifestyle choice more than anything.
Yeah, no, totally. It sounds like a very much different lifestyle. But if we then get into some of obviously the people that you're working with, and you've got a lot of experience there. So the people that are coming over, is there any like common mistakes you are actually seeing then from expats? And like, do you have any then tips around those? And that might be people getting up and leaving, or once they, arrive. Is there any like common trends that you see that most people, they probably come to after, the problems occurred or the issues now happen, and then you have to fix it? But is there any like common pitfalls you typically see with working people overseas?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in general, where people get it wrong is where they don't reach out for advice beforehand, and they'll just arrive and then kind of think, okay, now what am I doing? What do I need to do? I've got all these investments or assets or income set up in Australia or wherever else. What do I do with it? And I think that's the biggest mistake, is not to give yourself enough time to plan efficiently and effectively, because then you end up with unwanted and totally avoidable tax liabilities, for example. So I think my biggest tip is to reach out for advice. I would say minimum of 18 months before you move, even 2 years.
Wow.
A long time in advance, because it depends on your personal situation. But if you have a family, for example, or if you have investments set up and assets, property, you've got different income streams, and it's a slightly more complex situation, you definitely need advice quite far in advance, because I think I try and split it into 2 different areas or 2 chapters when people are moving to Spain or abroad to Europe. And chapter 1 is the hardest, because that's where you've got lots of different plates spinning. It's probably a little bit more stressful. You need to think of, where am I moving to? If you're moving with a family, you need to look at schooling. You need to understand the tax in that region, visas, immigration, currency differences, making decisions of your current setup, and are you retaining all of that, or you do need to make readjustments to that before you move abroad. So there's lots of big decisions to make, so you need to give yourself ample time. And then chapter 2 is like life in Spain. Okay, I'm here now, everything's done. What do I do? What makes the best sense with my investments and my tax situation to live life in Spain? But I think a lot of things come down to your personal objectives and also your time horizon. For example, if you were moving to Europe and you said, look, we're just moving to Europe for a couple of years and ultimately we'll move back to Australia, it's not ideal to sell up on everything and change everything. But if Europe is a sort of medium to long-term plan, as far as you definitely need more advice in quite a long period of time. Otherwise, as I say, you just run the risk of paying tax unnecessarily when things could have been completely avoided.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one, because do you then tend to see people that are more so coming to, say, Spain for a period of time, or they are generally coming there to stay permanently, because the clients that I work with, and generally the clients we only work with at Link Wealth that are overseas, they have the intention to come home. So they still will generally do a lot of their wealth creation back in Australia and can benefit from some of the rules over here, but they're going to come back here, and that's kind of the reason why they do that. Are people tending to have that view? They're coming for a few years or not?
Yeah, it changes. I mean, for myself, I mean, I was really young when I left Australia, but I said I was going for 2 years, and it's 18 years later, I'm still going.
Yep.
But I think it depends, because as I say, if it is a short-term stint, it doesn't make tax sense to wind things up, to close things down, keep it, and just report it and declare everything in Spain, and that's it, and then go back to Australia. But quite often people don't have the answer to that question. They'll say, well, ultimately we'd like to do Spain and we'll just see how it goes. I've honestly never met somebody that didn't enjoy living here, that hasn't loved it. But I think the problem with Australia, because it's such a great country to be from and to be in, and it's such a great safety net, we ultimately do have this plan to return. A lot of people have a plan to return. So I think people usually, they want to see how it goes. They want to test the water, and then maybe return, but they're not sure.
Yeah, okay. And then in those situations with people that have assets in that situation in other countries, is that sort of stuff that you guys will get involved with in terms of like whether to sell, maintain, taxation? Like I've had to dabble with some of that around non-residency rules for some of my clients that are in the UAE as non-residents, and understanding the cross-border taxation implications. And it's definitely a complex area, and it's not something I ever try to tackle on my own. And we always make sure that we're working with like a tax specialist in that space. Is that something that you guys then say work around? And are there any like tax implications that people need to be wary of, like in Spain or in in Europe in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would always encourage people, get tax advice in your home country first. And it may be a case that you're speaking to different tax professionals, one in Australia, one in the country that you're looking at, whether it's Spain or in Europe, and you need to get that local tax advice in each country by specialists in those countries. So I can certainly provide commentary on how things would be taxed in Australia. So I'm not an accountant, which I think it's blurry lines sometimes in Spain and Europe as to what financial advisors do and what accountants do, because there's a lot of crossover, but they're really different spaces at the same time. So I think a good exercise to go through is to speak to an English speaking Spanish accountant that's got international clients, even Australian clients, and say, look, can you run the numbers and do like a mock tax return? What will my life look like in Spain with this setup? And then you've just got no surprises. So I think that's a really good exercise to go through, because you just want to go in with your eyes open. You don't want surprises. You don't want unwanted tax bills the following year. You want to know exactly what you're in for. The other quirk of Spain is we're split into 17 different autonomous regions that all do completely different things from a tax point of view. So if someone's moving to Barcelona versus Malaga, it's two really different tax conversations, and some rules are national rules. They're the same all around Spain, but the majority of the rules are actually regional rules. So it's important to know which area you're looking at. Yeah, it makes my job very entertaining. I have to keep up to date with 17 regions or work, and they're not slight differences. They're radically different between each region. There's some taxes that exist in some regions and not others, for example. So it's
I can't even imagine. Yeah, like, so is that then looking at, like, if we talk about predominant investments clients will hold is like property and shares or investment portfolios. So in all those 17 different regions you mentioned, tax rates on all of those differ, or is there any like commonalities? Like, we have the 50% CGT discount. If you've owned an asset for over 12 months, you get a discount on that, and then it's all just taxed basically at your marginal tax rate in Australia, which is between 0 and 45%. But is that different between all of those different areas within Spain?
It does. So income tax rate's different, which goes up to sort of 48% typically as well for income tax, but it differs slightly at the top end in each region. But then there's something here called wealth tax, which doesn't exist in Australia. So you pay tax on your worldwide assets to Spain, but then some regions don't have it, and other regions have different allowances for it. So it's really regional. Capital gains tax is the same all around Spain, and things like inheritance tax, which I don't think that exists in Australia either. So death taxes, that's also radically different in every region as well. So that's why I think it's so important in Australia, coming from Australia into Spain or into Europe, to get that advice beforehand, because there's things that you won't even know to think about unless you speak to somebody. Plus, you can just save yourself so much time, energy, and effort, because you can trawl through things online. I think looking online is a really good starting point, just so you know it's not a blank canvas. But then it almost becomes kind of counterproductive, because, as I say, with these 17 regions of Spain, you could be looking to move to Barcelona, but without realizing it, you're reading something about Ibiza and the rates there. Or you could be reading something and the information's completely out of date, which is very common here. So if you just end up speaking to people directly, you just save so much energy and time from doing that.
Yeah, that sounds like an absolute minefield, honestly, to navigate, like all of those different regions. And then are you then seeing some people will make decisions actually based upon that, or not? That's kind of secondary to the lifestyle of where they want to be.
I would always say, from a personal perspective, lifestyle has to come before tax. Choose where you want to be, where you feel comfortable and happy and confident, and the tax planning can follow through. Because if you say, look, I'm moving to Andalusia, which is the south of Spain, it's a really progressive tax region. Tomorrow, overnight, it could be totally different, because they make these dramatic changes without any warning, and it depends on who's politically in favor at that point in time. So, for example, in my 10 years here, I've seen 4 very large changes to the region that I live in 10 years. So if you choose a tax region, it could be good, but it could be worse the next day. You don't know. So you've got to make it based on life, I think, and then the tax planning can follow through afterwards.
After it. And so if you're in a particular region over there, if you own shares, my assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong, would be it would be all taxed as per the region that you're in, even if you have like international shares and things like that. But what about property? Like if you own property in other regions, is it taxed in those regions, or it's all just taxed in the region where you kind of you live?
So it's all taxed in your local region, and you basically just need to put everything on the table. Everything that you own around the world, you need to say to the accountant, this is everything that I have, and they will just pick and choose what and how things need to be taxed. So different assets are taxed in different ways as well. But when it comes to investments, it's important to consider those, I think, before people are moving, because if they're not compliant, if they don't work in with the Spanish tax system, you have to pay tax on the growth every year, whether or not you're doing anything with it, whether or not you're taking withdrawals from it. You have to declare and pay tax, income tax on the growth every year. So if your plan is to stay for the medium to long term, say 5 years plus, that's when the considerations before you move need to take place, because is it then the most tax efficient setup? Probably not. So overseas property as well, you need to declare and pay tax on it, even if it's not rented out, even if it's vacant. So it's just
on the growth of the property if it's overseas.
No, you just pay a nominal amount of income tax, and you have to declare the property for wealth tax and things. So I think it's as I say, sound a bit repetitive, but just getting that advice beforehand, so then you know exactly, because then you know the worst case scenario from a tax point of view. Okay, if we moved and we keep everything, this is the tax. And some people might think, you know what, I'm pretty comfortable with that. And some people might think, wow, okay, that's the worst case. What, if anything, can be done to reduce and optimize taxation in Spain or wherever it is in Europe? So then you reverse engineer it and you just work backwards from there. But as I say, your overall time horizon and objectives are so much more important than that, because that will drive the tax conversations.
Yeah, sure. And so then in those situations, which is very fascinating, mind you, when you have, say, we're in Australia, got a lot of clients in Australia, and then say we have clients that, wanting to potentially move over into Europe or into Spain, the taxation there, because my understanding is like when you become a non-resident, you still have to do a tax return here in Australia, and you still have that, and you might have your family home, which is now an investment property, so you've kept that. You might have some shares and bits and pieces over here, and then you're paying the non-resident tax rates on all of that income. Is there any like treaties that exist there between, say, Spain and Australia? So if you're getting taxed here on Australia, all of those assets already, it's like Spain's not double dipping, or how does that work?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really good point. So there is a double taxation treaty that exists between Spain and about 200 other countries now, especially Australia. So you won't ever pay tax twice. So how it works is wherever the assets live, that country will typically take the priority, the preference. So you pay your taxes in Australia and whatever you have there. And then the Spanish accountant would take that into consideration and credit you against any taxes already paid. So you won't ever pay the same tax twice on any income or assets. It will equal out.
Yeah, that makes sense because I thought that was going to be quite harsh if that was not
No,
the case. That would
absolutely.
have hurt.
There'd be no one living here.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, we've sort of then touched on, some of the particulars around tax, but is there any like particular quirks to the system or any like rules over in Spain that are quite unique? Like I do a lot of work around family trusts here in
Mhm.
Australia. Like a trust's a thing over in Spain that people have or use, or do, people with, high levels of wealth like use any particular wealth vehicles that are relevant over in Spain or?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's a very common question I get from other Australians here is more on sort of the estate planning piece. I'm due to
Mm,
receive an inheritance. I've got a family
mm,
trust in Australia.
yep.
Basically, trusts don't work in Spain is the short of it. So trusts are really a
Wow.
common law concept from countries like
Mm,
Australia and the UK, for example, and Spain is a civil law country. So those two tax worlds just collide at
mhm.
times. And it's fine to have a trust or to be a beneficiary of a trust. But from a tax point of view, Spain just view it as completely transparent, which means if you're
Right.
the beneficiary or if you're the settlor of a trust, you need to declare it and pay tax on it in Spain as if you're the owner. So
Wow.
they don't understand trust. They don't want to understand trust because it really is, as I say, it's a common law concept and
Yeah.
it's not a common tool in Spain. It's so I think it has to be for non-fiscal reasons that people would set up. I set up trusts for clients, but it's for non-tax related reasons. But as I say, it's no problem
Right.
to have a trust and live here. You just need
Yeah.
to declare it to the accountant. So I think
Sure.
that's one main difference is a lot of Australians have trusts set up and British people as well, and they don't work here from a tax point of view. But it's not a problem to have them as long as you're declaring things in the right way.
Yeah. So essentially, it sounds like in Spain they just kind of look through them and just see it all, and it doesn't provide
Doesn't
any material
exist.
benefit.
Yeah.
It's all just, yeah, it's all assessed. So is there any like particular like vehicles then in Spain? Like there's other, I suppose, investments that I've seen overseas, like investment bonds, from a taxation point of view. Like, are there any particular like products or investments that are quite unique to Spain or Europe that aren't in some other countries or?
Yeah, so when you're looking at, say you live in Spain, okay, planning to stay here for the foreseeable future, we've got excess
Yeah.
cash. What's our investment options? In other
Yep.
countries, you have like a menu of options that you can choose from that makes sense depending on what your objectives are. In Spain, it's really narrow, the offering. It's very
Wow.
simple. There's either an investment vehicle that makes sense with the tax system, or there's everything else. So there's something
Hmm.
called as a Spanish compliant investment bond. And
Hmm.
it's an offshore bond. It's based somewhere in the European Union, so it's outside of Spain, but somewhere in the
Hmm.
EU. And it's as tax efficient as you can possibly get for life in Spain. So it's totally transparent. So you don't need to declare it, you don't need to report it. If you don't take any withdrawals from it, it grows free of tax in the background. As and when you take withdrawals, then it's the growth element subject to tax. So
Hmm.
in a nutshell, it's a very tax efficient vehicle for life in Spain, but it also works quite well in other countries as well, around Europe and the UK as well. So that's
Yeah.
as good
Okay.
as it gets. So it's a it reduces sort of income tax, wealth tax,
Yeah.
capital gains tax, and eventually it can reduce succession tax as well. So it ticks all the boxes. And that's the
Mhm.
only investment vehicle that really makes the most amount of tax sense here.
Is there a multitude of then options you can pick, like within the structure itself? Like you can be more aggressive, more conservative based upon kind of where you're at in life, or?
Absolutely. So we go through quite a rigorous sort of risk profiling exercise to see
Yeah.
how someone feels about the appetite when it comes to risk. And then we can control the funds and set up portfolios as per that individual's wishes. So the
Mm.
structure on the outside is the same. It doesn't matter who you speak to in Spain, everyone will say the same thing from
Hmm.
a recommendation point of view. But what's inside of that vehicle is where it really differs.
Yeah, sure. And so you can only own things like, I take it, like shares or managed funds in there. Like you can't own like a property, so to speak, in that sort of structure, can you?
No, there's other structures, things called a QNUPs, and
Hmm.
which is kind of like a pension scheme. It's more so for UK nationals where you can put property into it. But the thing
Yeah.
is, the Spanish accountant is the ultimate gatekeeper to the tax
Mm.
authorities. And you need to be on the same page as their understanding, because I think the thing that I struggled with the most professionally is everything is open to interpretation. You can ask one question to
Yeah.
five lawyers or accountants and get five totally different answers. So you can set things up in these really sophisticated vehicles, but at the end of the day, your accountant needs to be on the same page. And the investment solutions within Spain are really simple products. So anything overseas is considered to be kind of quite sophisticated in comparison. So I always recommend to people, look, you can do all these other things, but just use something that's compliant with the Spanish tax system, because it's known, it's liked, it's understood, and it's approved. It's the main thing that makes sense here, basically.
Yeah. Okay. And with all the different regions that you mentioned earlier, is because it sounds like from a taxation point of view, like Spain, it's not like a tax haven that people will flock to for just purely from a taxation point of view. But if of all of the regions, is there a particular region where they're actually like a lot? If people are coming from a wealth point of view, like they're probably going to go into this region because it's the most favorable and everyone knows that, or?
I was Madrid. So Madrid is where all the politicians live. So it's always been a pretty good region. Consistently,
Right.
there's no wealth tax there, for example. Andalusia, the south of Spain, I think I mentioned before, is quite a progressive region. But there's something interesting on that, because Spain, when you look online and when you hear about it, it can sound a bit doom and gloom, but it really doesn't need to be. You can actually set yourself up here in a really great tax efficient way. Plus, as I say, it's a lower cost of living in comparison to Australia and other, especially Northern European countries. But there's quite an interesting tax treatment or regime that came. It's been around since I think it's 2005, when David Beckham came to Spain and played for Real Madrid. It was around June 2005. So there's something that's come out named after him called the Beckham Law, and it's a tax law, but it wasn't that popular before, and it was re-engineered last year when this digital nomad visa came out in Spain to try and entice people moving to Spain for employment reasons. And it's pretty amazing if you can get it. So when you come to Spain, you need to apply for it within 6 months of arrival. But what it means is if you do come to Spain for work reasons and you tick all the boxes and you get the Beckham Law set up, you only pay a flat rate of income tax of 24% on any income in Spain up to 600,000 euros. And everything outside of Spain is totally off the tax radar. So if you come here and you have everything set up in Australia, you don't declare it to Spain, you don't report it, you can sell and buy properties, investments, anything you like. As long as it's outside of Spain, it's totally off the tax radar for Spain for up to 6 years. So a lot of people, especially Australians, are coming in now and they're getting the Beckham Law. So it's great because you can then test the water and think, do we like Spain? Do we not like Spain? You've got 6 years to decide. And if you do think we want to live here for the foreseeable future, you've got up to 6 years to think about, restructuring your portfolio if you need to. So it gives you this delaying mechanism, and it's great, as I say, from a tax point of view. 24% income tax, that's it. And it's like, from a tax perspective as well, you're treated as a non-tax resident for those 6 years. So that's a really interesting tax treatment it's becoming more widely known now, as I say, since this digital nomad visa was introduced last year.
Yeah, no, that's I genuinely have not heard of that, and I find that absolutely fascinating that law is named after David Beckham.
I know, the funny thing is, it actually now it excludes professional sports players as well, even though it was to try and entice him into Spain to pay the least amount of tax possible. But now it used to be really rare, and now I speak to people all day in, day out. They're here on Beckham Law, and the conversations are, oh my gosh, okay, it's finishing in a year. What do we do? What's tax in Spain? We've never had to sort of think about it. So it's a really great one. If you are considering Europe or Spain's on the radar, I would look into that and see if you can tick the boxes to apply for it, because it's a very easy transition into Spain, and the tax conversation will be really short if you can get the Beckham Law.
Well, it kind of allows you to sort of try before you buy and fully sort of jump right in. No, that's great. No, that's a really good one. I think listeners get a lot out of that. Of course, if anyone is considering heading over to Spain, but a lot of the clients that then you see, a lot of the clients, I suppose, of yours, if we're talking of your own clients, are they actually then typically holding a lot of assets in a lot of different countries when they come over? Do they actually try to invest a lot in overseas or in Europe? I suppose, like, because we're over here in Australia, everywhere kind of seems far away, whereas when you're in Europe, everything's just so close. You go to your neighbor in your new country. But what does that look like? Because a lot of my clients, like Australians, kind of just tend to keep everything at home. Is that similar in Spain, or are they building up wealth in buying properties other countries, or do they generally more so have it before they come and then they keep it all in Spain?
Yeah, I think it depends on their life stage. Usually when people are retiring or they're retired, their aim is to kind of simplify and consolidate, especially because
Yeah.
they're looking to move to Europe and their family live in Australia or in the UK or Canada, wherever it may be. And they think we need to simplify matters. We need to sell down on assets. We need to consolidate. We need to just make life really easy. So that demographic would typically move here with few investments and assets because they've done all of that tax planning and selling down on things before the move. Younger people will typically, they always say to me, the opening line is, oh, look, I don't know if you can help me. My situation's really unique, or it's really difficult. And it's actually not.
Yeah.
It feels messy having assets abroad or in different countries. But as long as you report everything, then it's absolutely no problem to have. It's a very typical scenario for quite international families and individuals to move here and to still have a foot in Australia and in different countries. And it's fine, you know, it needs to make tax sense. But as I say, as long as you're reporting everything, it's no problem. From an estate planning point of view, it can be a little bit more complicated. You need to make sure you've got wills in each of these countries. You need to make sure you understand local succession laws and things. But again, it just comes down to getting advice.
Yeah. And in those situations, like the estate planning ones, it's a pretty tricky place to navigate. And you touched on the death tax and inheritance tax. I wouldn't mind just getting an idea of that, because people sometimes there's a bit of a misconception that exists here in Australia, but it doesn't. But there is tax that happens on superannuation, which is somewhat like a death tax over here in Australia. But if someone is then over in Spain and say they have, like, say it's an Australian, but now they're a non-resident, they're living over in Spain, but they've still got assets here in Australia, in that type of situation, like if they pass away, is Spain trying to get their hands on everything from a inheritance and death tax point of view, or is the stuff that might be over here in Australia, is that kind of segregated from an inheritance for, you know, maybe family that's actually back here, and I'm sure that is getting quite complicated, so I'm not trying to throw too much at you with that one.
No, it's a really good question. So if it essentially works if the following two scenarios take place. Say you live in Spain, you're a resident in Spain, you live here. Spanish succession tax, which is like inheritance tax, applies if you live in Spain and you inherit from anybody anywhere in the world. Because you live here, you pay tax. Or if there's a Spanish asset, say Spanish property, for example, anything physically in Spain, the individual or an asset or an investment will attract succession tax. And the differing part with Spain is it's on the recipient to pay the tax bill. So, for example, if people have lived in the UK, the deceased picks up the tax bill and it's deducted from their estate. In Spain, if I inherit from anybody in Australia, I'm the one that has to pay the tax within 6 months. And if I inherit something, I can't sell that asset first and use the proceeds to pay the tax bill. So if I inherit a property in Australia, I have to declare it and pay tax on it to Spain within 6 months, and time's ticking. So it's really different as to how it works. It moves very quickly here. But the good news is it's become better in recent years, in very recent times, for succession tax rates. So it does differ significantly in each region, but in a lot of regions now, there's like a 99% relief for the recipient. And the other part that they do is they group beneficiaries into 4 different categories depending on the closeness of the relationship to the deceased. So this all stems from this Napoleonic code. It sounds to us quite archaic, being from a common law country, but it's about forcing heirship through bloodlines essentially in this part of Europe. So if you're a spouse or a direct ascendant or descendant, you're a child, grandchild, then you have the most amount of allowances. And in a lot of regions now, there is a 99% relief. So you'll have 1% subject to tax, or it'll potentially be 0, but you still need to declare and report it within 6 months. So scenario planning, I think, is a common conversation I have with Australians here. They'll say, look, you know, I've got aging parents, or I'm potentially inheriting from a grandparent. What do I need to do to prepare for that from an estate planning point of view, and have those conversations?
Yeah, okay. And just going on to a different subject then, superannuation is obviously like an amazing part of the Australian system. Does Spain have an equivalent to superannuation?
So I didn't realize how amazing superannuation was until I left Australia. I just thought that's how, you know, pensions around the world existed. You know, you've got sufficient funding for your retirement. It's mandatory. It feels difficult when you're young because you think, oh, I want more of that now. And actually, I feel like Australia and New Zealand are pioneers around the world for how good your pension and retirement provision is, because it does not work like that in other countries, and people retire with absolutely nothing. So, as I said before, I speak to a lot of British people here, and the UK introduced something called auto enrollment with a kind of similar-ish concept, but it was just like too late, basically. You know, people are
Yeah.
retiring with absolutely nothing. So, it's just my knowledge of superannuation is it's quite rigid. You can't really transfer it. You can't access it until that specific age. Whereas other pensions, you can transfer it, you can do things. But a lot of conversations as well I have with people is a lot of people that have traveled a lot or lived in other countries, they're always kind of nervous about feeling like they don't have adequate pension provision for later in life, because they might say, look, I left Australia, like me, you know, left Australia when I was 21. You know, we don't feel like we've lived here, there, and everywhere. We've got little pots dotted around. It's not enough. What do we do? So then it's conversations as to, you know, you don't have to consider a traditional pension as a pension anymore. You can have investment vehicles or properties or other more liquid assets that are fully accessible and flexible that you can consider as your pension. So just changing the mindset of the way that we think about that.
Yeah. And is there then like an equivalent to like a government pension that you get like at a certain age in Spain? Like you qualify and is it assets and income tested like Australia, or does everyone get it essentially?
So you're entitled to a state pension once you've contributed for 15 years here into Social Security. So, and then it's basically dismal, to be honest. So you can't rely on it in any way, shape, or form. You have to have your own private pension provision. But even setting up a private pension here, it's not a common, there's no tax relief and things like that. It doesn't work in the same way at all. So it's not a common sort of road to go down for people to build a local Spanish pension. As I say, then people will think, well, I'll set up an investment and just earmark it for later in life. I'll just, you know, have it set up for growth, and that can be my pension. And then if I do move back to Australia or elsewhere, it can follow me there. So traditional Spanish pensions, it's not as good as Australia or other countries, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I guess the superannuation system in Australia, it's just because it's forced essentially upon anyone that's basically working. I think a lot of people, and if people are, you know, listening to this, probably take it for granted in a way, because then when you explain how the system works over in Spain, like it's basically all on you. Nothing's essentially really given to you, and you need to, it's probably more of an emphasis of why you actually need to be getting advice. So you are planning in advance and you are building up those wealth vehicles and income streams, so that when you get to the time that you don't want to work, you've actually got something. Where we're obviously super lucky here in Australia, like we've got that force mandated certain amount that's taken out from your pay if you're an employee, and that's, you know, put into that superannuation vehicle, which is, you know, the most tax effective vehicle here in Australia. It's taxed at 15% year to year, and then once you get to 60 and older, if you retire or meet a certain condition, it's tax-free money. You know, so I think a lot of people in Australia probably honestly take super for granted. And I guess you don't know until you go to the other side of the world, maybe how other people
absolutely
are
not all pensions are created equal. And I took it for, I mean, I didn't understand the mechanics of it when I left, but now that I'm looking back and you look into how superannuation works, it's amazing, you know. And I think the fact that you can even sacrifice extra amounts, and it's fantastic in the way that it works. So you need to look after yourself much more, I think, when you move abroad. It's on you to take the responsibility, so you don't have that luxury of thinking, this thing's just been kind of growing in the background, now I'll tap into it. You have to do that from a much earlier age.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then in just terms of like wrapping things up, Nicole, well, you touched on, you know, some of the things for people considering when they're leaving. You touched on those two separate chapters, but, you know, before we finish up, I want to make sure that is there any other, I suppose, tips of what you'd be saying for people who are considering to leave or on that trajectory, like they haven't done it, so there is still time to plan. Is there any other like key important steps that you would mention or considerations to think about other than what you mentioned earlier around those two chapters?
Yeah, I would say just, again, you know, get advice, because the risk that you run as well, it just looks really daunting, and oh my gosh, there's just a million things to consider. It's too hard basket. I just won't do it. I'll just dream about it and I won't actually do it, which is terrible, because it's such an amazing country, and Europe in general is so fantastic to live in. It's such a different lifestyle and culture. So you do have to change your thinking with a lot of things. But I wouldn't do something because it seems too difficult, because as I said at the outset, it's such a well-trodden path now to move, especially in recent years. So the biggest takeaway and my number one piece of advice would be to get advice, speak to people, save yourself so much time and energy than trawling through and trying to navigate things on your own. And advice, you know, it's not expensive. If you speak to a Spanish accountant, it's probably like 60 euros for a mock tax return and a consultation with them to potentially save you thousands of euros or
Massive.
dollars in taxation. It's a great way to do it. So I would say get advice is the number one takeaway.
Yeah, and then one final question: are you planning to come back to Australia again, or you're done? You're not planning
I'm
to come back to
done,
Australia
to be
anytime
honest.
soon?
I love Australia
Yeah,
and I feel so grateful
yeah,
to be from Australia. But because I come back
yeah,
for a month now and work remotely every year,
yeah.
it's sufficient for me. I love Europe. I love Spain. I don't feel like the grass is greener. I really feel so connected to living here and really lucky to live here as well. It just really suits me as an individual. And as I say, I love that slowing down sort of concept. And it's such a fun place to live. It can feel inefficient at times when you're used to sort of things just working on
Yeah.
time, for example, and working well. There's a few inefficiencies, but it's 100% worth it. So I feel really fortunate that I can come back to Australia and just work remotely for August, and for me that's sort of sufficient. So no plans at all to come back to live.
That's exciting. No, that's good. Well, I really appreciate obviously your time on here today, and really appreciate your insights. And if anyone then wants to actually reach out and have a chat with you, what's the best way to reach out and engage with you and obviously the business?
Sure. So I would say send me an email or maybe take a look at me on LinkedIn if anybody uses LinkedIn. So my
Yep.
email is nicole.sandler@chasebuchanan.com. So Chase Buchanan is the company that I work for. And
Yep.
on LinkedIn, my name is Nicole Sandler, financial planner. And I do a lot of educational content for people thinking of moving into Spain or into Europe to try and help with that transition, talking about sort of tax and just lifestyle and life as an expatriate as well. So hopefully it's of interest if anyone is on LinkedIn.
And we'll put, obviously your details in the show notes as well. And when we distribute it out to all of our listeners as well, we'll make sure all of those links are in there. But we'll wrap it up today, guys. And like I said, Nicole, really appreciate your time. Thanks to everyone that is listening. And if you are getting value out of what we are going through on these podcasts, please give us 5 stars on Spotify and Apple. As I always say, we're on all of the social medias, LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram. If you can't get enough of us already, we're on all of the social media platforms as well. And as of course, everything that we are speaking about in these podcasts, none of it actually is advice. So if you ever do want to chat about your personal situation, you can always reach out to any of the advisors in our business. Or if you are in fact someone that's considering to go over to Spain or heading overseas to Europe, I think you'd best be having a chat to Nicole first before doing so. But really appreciate your time, Nicole, and look forward to actually seeing you again on another podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Josh. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.